I want to start this morning with a radical assertion, and that is that foundations matter. That foundations can take on issues other actors in society can't or won't, as many have observed, the toughest challenges, and that therefore they matter greatly and their effectiveness matters greatly. And you're saying, like, what's radical about that? Well, lately, I think if you read the trade press or the mainstream press, you can start to think, we don't need the nonprofit sector. We don't need foundations. Business is going to solve all our problems. What we need is more business thinking. I watched a video of a TED Talk by Michael Porter of Harvard Business School, and he said the following, and I quote, "There is no trade-off between social progress and economic efficiency. Business can change the world. I know it, I'm seeing it, I'm feeling it," unquote. So much for evidence. Look, of course business does much good. Of course it does. And also sometimes does things that are not so good. But seriously, let's keep it in perspective. Sometimes I feel like I picked up a copy of The Onion, but it's not The Onion. Can venture capital save the world? Venture capital is wonderful, it's important. Save the world? Let's keep it real and honest. Professor Porter and Forbes may not see a trade-off between profit and social impact, but a lot of companies apparently do, or we wouldn't have issues like this. This is just from recent headlines. Now look, this is the part where I tell you I am not trying to beat up on companies. Small, medium, and large businesses are vital. I believe in free market capitalism. I have an MBA. Unlike Bernie Sanders, I'm not a socialist. I'm not even a democratic socialist. But we need to stop pretending that there isn't a role for mission-driven nonprofits that are about purpose, not profit. Right? And let's stop pretending that all the answers to our problems lie on Wall Street, or for that matter, in Silicon Valley. Speaking of Silicon Valley, any of you guys see the New York Times a week ago Sunday, I think it was? The front of the Weekend Review section had a piece about how Silicon Valley's got philanthropy all figured out. Like, I don't even know why we're here, actually. President of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Emmett Carson, very smart guy, thoughtful guy, but maybe needs to get out of Silicon Valley a little bit more. He's quoted in the New York Times as saying, "We see the future today, you all see the future tomorrow." Like I said, what are we even doing here? So look, this kind of confidence, I guess it's admirable at some level, but another person who's got a lot of it is a guy named Sean Parker. You remember him? He's a guy who founded Napster, was involved in the beginning days of Facebook. Justin Timberlake played him in the movie Social Network, if that's helping. So he had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I don't know if you guys saw this one, but he had a lot to say about how philanthropy should be done. Now, he hasn't actually done much of it yet, but he had a lot to say about how philanthropy should be done. And he took some pretty tough shots at places like where many of you work. He wrote, "The executive directors of most major private foundations, endowments, and other nonprofit institutions are dedicated first and foremost to preserving the resources and reputations of the institutions they run. This is achieved," he wrote, "by creating layers of bureaucracy to oversee the resources of the institution and prevent it from taking on too much risk. As a result," he says, "many large private foundations become slow, conservative, saddled with layers of permanent bureaucracy, essentially taking on the worst characteristics of government." Okay. So, look, there are actually, sadly, some foundations that come a little bit too close to that caricature. I've been to some of them. But they are very much the exception, not the norm. And that kind of generalization just isn't helpful. And I think it's important to remember that nobody has a monopoly on effectiveness. I think Jim Collins is one business guru who actually gets this. So he writes, most businesses are mediocre. And think about it. By the way, just think about it. Like if you flew United here or, you spent time waiting for the cable guy or whatever, most businesses are mediocre, like most of everything in life. So why would we want to emulate mediocrity? So anyway, love business, all for it, plays a distinct role in our society. The nonprofit sector and foundations play another different distinct role in our society. And guess what? Foundation effectiveness is actually super hard in a way that's different from effectiveness in other areas. I know, people look at you and they say, wow, that's awesome, you work at a foundation, how cushy is that? But if you want to do it well, and I bet most of you do, if you want to really maximize impact with the resources that you have, it isn't easy. It just isn't. So I want to talk this morning about what it takes to be effective. And when I tell you, you're going to say, oh, come on. This guy came all the way from Massachusetts to tell us this. Like, we knew this already. Because it's going to sound like exactly what it takes to be effective at anything, but then we're going to talk about why it's particularly challenging in foundation land. So I think it's about 4 things. Clear goals, coherent strategies to achieve those goals, disciplined implementation of strategy, and relevant performance indicators to assess progress. Okay, duh. These aren't original thoughts. There's nothing fancy about this. But it is how it plays out that's difficult. So let's take the first one. Let's talk about goals. So if you are Howard Schultz, say, and you run Starbucks, your goal's pretty clear. You're trying to maximize revenue and profit by selling coffee in all kinds of cute flavors and sizes that we didn't even know we wanted, right? All over the world. That's your goal. Now, if you're Schultz, you want to do it in a way, be a good citizen, corporate responsibility, but the goal is pretty clear. In foundation land, it's much more challenging. How do you pick goals? There are so many pressing social challenges. How do you choose to do this and not that? So I had lunch once with a guy who worked for many years, wonderful guy, at a couple of large foundations. He was the head of communications. And he told me a story about working at one of these foundations, and they hired a new CEO. And the new CEO was from outside Philanthropy. So the guy I was having lunch with told me a story. His name's Frank, and said, Frank, you got to orient the new guy, because you're the one who's been in the foundation world the longest. So Frank goes to the new CEO's office, and the new CEO asks him lots of questions. And he says to Frank, what is the greatest mistake that I'm going to make? Frank said, well, that's a good question. And he said, the biggest mistake you're going to make is you're going to be drinking your coffee one morning, and you're going to be reading the paper, and you're going to read about something that really touches you, disturbs you. And you're going to say, I run one of the biggest foundations in the world. We got to do something about this. It's our moral obligation to do something about it. And you're going to walk into the office, and you're going to set in motion a process that leads to the creation of a new program. And then 6 months later, maybe you're listening to NPR or CNN or Fox. That guy probably wouldn't have listened to Fox, but anyway. And you're shaving, and you hear about something else, and you say, well, that's connected to another thing we're doing, and we're one of the biggest foundations in the world, and we got to do something about this. And you're going to walk into the office, and you're going to set in motion a process that leads to the creation of a new program. And maybe 3 years, 5 years, 10 years is going to go by, and you're going to walk into that foundation, and you're going to see rows of cubes and offices, and you're going to look across, and you're not going to know what it all adds up to. And Frank told me this story. He was a modest guy. I don't think he was embellishing. He said that's exactly what the CEO ended up doing, making exactly the mistake Frank told him he would make. Look, it's hard not to. The challenges are interdependent. It's hard to stay focused. But I believe you have to push yourself to have some level of focus. This is the last time I'll quote Jim Collins, I promise, but he spoke at our conference a few years back, and he said this, and I like this. He said, "Disciplined action begins with piercing clarity about what you will choose to not do." He said, "The world's awash with opportunities for contribution to do good, so it's what you choose to not do that matters, so you can focus on what you choose to focus on." In a survey of CEOs that we conducted at the Center for Effective Philanthropy of foundations with $5 million in giving or more, we asked, how many programmatic goals do you have? 26% said more than 6. They were working toward more than 6 goals. Only 6% said just 1. So ask yourself, are your goals specific? Are they ambitious? Are they clear? How many are they? How many are there? If you walked into your foundation and asked every staff member and every board member to write down the goals, would they look the same or different? Alignment around a few clear goals is key. And it's much harder than it is in other sectors. So if goals are the what, then strategy is the how, right? Strategy is how you're going to get it done. Strategy, strategy, strategy. Everybody talks about strategy. Everybody's got a strategy. But here, too, it plays out differently. In business, there's a competitive dynamic. And so you want your strategy to be yours alone. I'm not going to tell my competitors what my strategy is. For foundations, if your strategy is yours alone, it will fail. It will fail. Strategy plays out differently when there are no competitive dynamics. In business, it's about unique positioning. In philanthropy, if somebody says, actually, you can make a difference doing exactly what we're doing toward your very important goal, would you demur and say, oh, no, that's not our unique position. We don't want to do that. No. If the objective is impact, you would do exactly what had been shown to work somewhere else. So how to define strategy in philanthropy then? This is the way we define it. It's maybe a little jargony, but hopefully it helps. So framework for decision making that's rooted in the external context in which the foundation works and includes a hypothesized causal connection between the use of foundation resources and achievement of goals. Again, almost everybody says they've got a strategy. But we see in our research a disconnect between the rhetorical embrace of strategy and its use day to day by foundation CEOs and program officers. It's really hard. Strategy in philanthropy requires a relentless focus on the logic. It requires being evidence and data-driven, but also constantly open to new ideas. It needs to be iterative. It can't be fixed. Some critics of foundation strategy say, oh no, strategic philanthropy is about being arrogant and isolated and top down and telling grantees what to do. That's not good strategy. That's not good strategy. Good strategy is informed constantly by the folks closest to the problem, including, guess what? Including the people whose lives you're trying to improve, who might know something about what strategy is likely to be more or less effective. So it's not easy. But when it works, when strategy is shared across foundations and other institutions, when the logic is there, when it's iterated based on what's learned from the folks on the ground, tremendous results can be achieved. There are so many examples of progress that foundations in our country have contributed to. So many. Some of them are well-worn, some of them may be newer to you. I'll just cite a few. Our 911 emergency response system, better treatment of diseases such as diabetes, improved outcomes for foster kids in places like California, progress in childhood obesity, civil rights progress for African Americans, civil rights for gays and lesbians, preservation of habitats for natural wildlife. All foundations playing a crucial role. They didn't do it alone, but a crucial role with strategies that were sound, strategies that changed and iterated as conditions changed. But of course, articulating the strategy is in some respects much easier than actually getting it done, than implementing it day in and day out. Steve Schroeder, who was the president of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, said, execution trumps strategy every time. I don't quite get that, because you need a strategy to execute against, but I get the point that he was making, which is it so often breaks down here. And when it does, it's often about relationships. It's often about relationships, and in particular, the foundation grantee relationship. We at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, as you may know, have surveyed tens and tens of thousands of grantees of hundreds of foundations at this point. And these are the kind of things we hear from grantees when it's not working. Some funders seem to come into the relationship thinking they know more than we do. Funders do probably spend more time reading academic literature, but they don't spend time with low-income people. Well, they have much to teach us. We also have much to teach them, and the best funders realize that. Without good relationships with grantees and other actors, you won't have good information. You won't have good information in order to make good decisions. What does it look like when funders don't prioritize understanding the issues on the ground, when they don't take the time to develop relationships, when they think that they have the solution and can impose it and will be thanked for it? And I don't mean to pick on anybody, but it looks a lot like what happened in Newark, New Jersey, with the $100 million contribution that Mark Zuckerberg made. And I don't usually make book recommendations, but The Prize by Dale Risikoff, which just came out, is a book every foundation program officer and foundation leader should read, because it's a cautionary tale about how complicated and difficult it is to really achieve progress on very vexing social problems. And it's a cautionary tale about leaving out of the equation in the conversation the folks in the neighborhoods, the kids themselves in the schools, the people whose lives you're trying to improve. To understand whether you're implementing strategy well, to understand whether you're making progress, you need good information. You need to be learning. You need indicators of performance. And this is maybe the toughest part. Because again, it's different than it is in business. There is no analog to return on investment. There are no universal measures. It's complicated and hard to assess performance. Now, this is not a new concept, right? Carnegie, Rockefeller, Russell Sage Foundation, they cared very much about evidence 100 years ago. It's not all like the first, sometimes I read media reports and it's like, Bill Gates cares about the impact of his philanthropy as if that's a new idea, as if nobody else ever has. So the problem is that it's so hard, so hard. We did a survey a few years ago of CEOs of large foundations, and what we saw is that assessment's a very high priority. And the foundation CEOs think that progress is being made, but that there's much, much more work to be done. We also see that foundations are using a broader range of indicators of performance than they were a decade ago. So that's great, that's progress. But there's much more to be done. We need to know what works if we're gonna invest a lot of resources in expanding it, right? We need to know before we do that it actually works. And too often we don't. So I often use kind of historical examples that everybody's heard before because you minimize the chances of offending people. DARE and Scared Straight, right? So these programs had either no effect or the opposite of the intended effect. So Scared Straight, which was about bringing in former incarcerated prisoners into school assemblies to talk about crime and how you shouldn't pursue a life of crime, when finally the attitudes of students who attended these assemblies were measured, turns out they had more positive views of criminal behavior. They were more likely in their self-reported attitudes to want to pursue a life of crime than before they'd seen the assembly. So you can actually have the opposite of your intended effect. But let's not just be safe and talk about the historic examples. What are the present day contemporary examples of things that we're all saying, or many of us are saying, oh, let's do that because it just makes sense, despite the evidence that it may not actually work? I'd suggest one is incentive pay for teachers, where it makes sense to me. Let's reward the good teachers. I got to know a guy named Roland Fryer. I think he's one of the youngest tenured professors at Harvard, and he spoke at our conference a couple years ago, and he studied this rigorously, very rigorously. And he found in a randomized control trial in more than 200 New York public schools, no evidence that teacher incentives increase student performance, attendance, or graduation, nor do I find any evidence that incentives change student or teacher behavior. That doesn't mean all programs don't work, but the program in New York didn't work. So often, we pursue things that just feel like they make sense. Of course that's going to make a difference, without really holding ourselves to a rigorous test of whether it really is making the difference that we think it is. Now, does that mean you all need to fund randomized control trials? No, of course it doesn't. But pay attention to the evidence. So I think about examples like New York State Health Foundation. They wanted to do something about diabetes and the outcomes for diabetes patients. It had been rigorously studied, and there's certain protocols that lead to better outcomes for diabetes patients. But in the state of New York, many doctors were not trained in those protocols. So New York State Health Foundation set out to ensure that doctors were trained. And what did they measure? They measured how many doctors they got trained. They didn't then go out and try to re-measure the outcomes for the diabetes patients because that had already been established. So be smart about what do you need to know, what do you need to measure, and try to root your work in evidence. And if something is new and innovative and untested, that's fine, but set it up in a way where you can over time know whether it really lives up to its promise. Another problem is that today, so much of the assessment work that foundations do puts your interests ahead of the interests of the grantees that you fund. So what we see is that nonprofits, contrary to some stereotypes, really care about assessment. They really want to know if what they're doing is working. And foundation leaders, when we survey them, say that they're helping nonprofits to do better data collection and assessment work. 3/4 of foundation leaders indicate that they're supporting nonprofits in that effort. But guess what? 2/3 of nonprofits say they don't receive any support from any of their foundations for their assessment work. And even for the larger, like a few $1 million in grants or larger foundations whose grantees we've surveyed, the median budget of these organizations is $1.4 million. Where are they going to get resources to do the data collection, develop the evidence that you want them to develop, if not from you? If not from you. Now, some foundations do this really well. Two that do, who we profiled in our research on this topic, which we released in the spring and which is available on our website, 2 foundations that do a really good job of supporting their nonprofits in their assessment efforts, a really good job compared to others, and we know this from our comparative grantee surveys, are Southeastern Council Foundation's members, Mary Reynolds Babcock and the Assisi Foundation of Memphis. Let's give them a hand. So they're stepping up. They're providing that kind of support. We have interviews with staff of those foundations in our research report. Read it, follow up, and then follow their lead in providing nonprofits with the support they need to get the data they need to get better, to pursue the shared goals that you both have. David Hunter, who's used to be evaluation director at Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, who wrote a really good book on evaluation in human services. In the preface of his book, he says this: I intend this document to be an admonishment to those funders who demand performance in which they don't invest, results for which they don't pay, and accountability from which they exempt themselves. Stop the madness. Except if you ever met him, he would say it even louder than I did. So look, if you don't assess, if you don't get a reality check, you're subject to a phenomenon that exists in all walks of life, which is the tendency to overestimate your own contributions and effectiveness. And I don't mean to make myself terribly unpopular here. I do have a rental car, but it's not idling outside yet. But we all do this. We think we're better parents than we are. We think we're better drivers than we are. But for foundation leaders, you're particularly susceptible to this problem because you're surrounded by folks who are predisposed to tell you, honestly, what they think you want to hear. So what we see then, when we survey CEOs and we ask, well, how much progress has been made toward the big goals you're working on by all the different actors working on those goals? We see kind of a sober assessment. A quarter say a lot, most say moderate amount, and fewer than a quarter say a little progress. But when we ask these same folks, well, what about your foundation's contribution? Different story. 60% say, no, my foundation's made a big contribution. So look, be aware of the tendency to think that things are going better than they are. And make sure you're bringing in different kinds of information that challenges your assumptions. And I think a good place to start is hearing from grantees, declined applicants, and other stakeholders who might not be totally forthright with you. Hearing from them in a really confidential and safe and comparative way, and that's a big part of what we've done at CEP over the last 14 years, is try to create those feedback loops. So I hope I've illustrated that, in fact, well, it sounds easy, and I think you know this because you live it, really being effective for a foundation isn't so easy. It takes these 4 elements, but each of them play out in distinctly challenging ways. None of these are radical concepts, and they're not new either. By the way, most things that get represented as new are not new. And that's certainly true in philanthropy. There's a good book by Joel Fleischman and Tom Tierney, and in it, it's called Give Smart, and in it they imagine Andrew Carnegie and Bill Gates having dinner, writing that they would have a lot in common. The authors speculate that as, quote, rigorous, disciplined, and deeply strategic men, the industrial baron and the software tycoon would be highly compatible. If Gates were to mention strategic philanthropy, social entrepreneurs, or scaling what works in the course of the conversation, Carnegie might not recognize the phrases, but he would immediately understand the concepts. So the concepts are neither new nor radical, but they're incredibly hard to act on each day. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, no matter how successful they may have been in business, on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley. As Warren Buffett wisely said, in business, you look for the easy things to do. In philanthropy, you take on the important challenges, and it's a much tougher game. Interestingly, Andrew Carnegie, 100 years prior, made almost exactly the same observation, that it's much easier to accumulate wealth than distribute it wisely. So each of you here today has a crucial role in making decisions every day about how resources are used to make a difference against the important goals you're working on. How you do that work each day, the discipline you bring to that effort, it matters. It really matters, because foundations at their best can make enormous contributions against really pressing social challenges. So do it well. Do it well. Thank you.